His mistress invited his poor ex-wife to mock her. She arrived in a $1.8 million dress. What would you do if someone invited you to a party just to humiliate you in front of everyone? This is where the story begins. The cruelest invitations are never sent to celebrate you. They are sent to remind you where someone believes you belong. Rain shimmered across the marble entrance of the Astoria Crown Hotel as sleek black SUVs rolled beneath the glowing canopy, their headlights reflecting off polished stone like ribbons of liquid gold. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers scattered warm light over nearly 200 guests dressed in designer tuxedos and couture gowns, while the gentle sound of a string quartet floated through conversations about investments, luxury developments, and old family fortunes. Every detail had been planned to impress Chicago's elite, but for one woman, the evening had been designed for something far more personal. Blythe Carradine stood near the center of the ballroom in a shimmering champagne-colored gown, smiling with the effortless confidence of someone convinced the night belonged entirely to her. A crystal flute rested gracefully between perfectly manicured fingers as she greeted investors, reporters, and socialites with polished charm. Then, lowering her voice just enough to appear discreet while making certain everyone nearby could still hear, she said, "Graham's ex-wife accepted the invitation. I honestly didn't think she'd come." Several guests exchanged amused smiles. One woman quietly asked if the divorce had been recent. Blythe laughed softly before answering, 3 years. She never really recovered. I thought tonight might give her some closure. The word closure drifted through the crowd like expensive perfume, pleasant on the surface while carrying something unmistakably cruel underneath. At the opposite end of the ballroom, hotel staff adjusted the final place cards before dinner service began. Most displayed company names, executive titles, or philanthropic organizations beneath each guest's name. One card stood alone on a small round table near the service entrance, almost hidden beside a decorative column, where waiters quietly entered and exited the room carrying silver trays. It simply read, Zora Lennox, guest of the Halstons. No title, no profession, no recognition. Just a reminder that she had been invited under someone else's name. Blythe glanced toward the lonely table and smiled with quiet satisfaction. I wanted her to feel comfortable, she joked to a nearby couple. I wasn't sure she'd recognize half the people here anyway. Polite laughter followed. Graham Halston forced a smile as several business associates chuckled along, although his fingers tightened around his glass of bourbon just a little longer than necessary. He wore confidence like another tailored suit, but somewhere beneath that polished exterior lingered the uncomfortable awareness that inviting Zora had been Blythe's idea, not his. Still, he had agreed. Perhaps because part of him wanted proof that moving on had been the right decision. Perhaps because success sometimes convinces people they deserve to rewrite history. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation as photographers prepared near the staircase, waiting for distinguished guests to arrive. Conversations shifted toward the evening's major announcement involving the historic Astoria Crown Restoration Project, a contract every major development company wanted. Graham believed tonight would place him one step closer to securing the opportunity of his career. Across the room, Blythe accepted another compliment on the event before casually adding, "If Zora actually dressed up, I'd be shocked." More laughter followed. Someone asked whether she still drove that old sedan. Another guessed she'd probably borrowed something respectable for the evening. Nobody questioned whether those comments were kind. Nobody suggested changing the seating arrangement. It was easier to laugh when the target wasn't in the room. Outside, rain tapped gently against the hotel's towering glass entrance. A black luxury sedan rolled quietly beneath the covered drive and came to a smooth stop. A valet hurried forward as the rear passenger door slowly opened. For a brief second, only the polished heel of an elegant shoe appeared against the wet pavement. Then a graceful hand emerged, removing a long black cashmere cloak from slender shoulders. Beneath it, a breathtaking midnight sapphire gown caught the light like the first stars appearing in an evening sky, its intricate embroidery sparkling with black diamonds and silver brilliance. The valet instinctively stopped breathing for half a heartbeat before collecting himself. Without saying a word, Zora Lennox looked toward the towering hotel doors, calm, composed, and entirely unreadable. Inside the ballroom, no one yet realized that the woman they had invited to become the night's greatest joke was about to walk through those doors carrying a truth powerful enough to silence every voice in the room. As Zora placed one hand on the polished bronze handle of the towering hotel doors, she caught her own reflection in the glass for only a heartbeat. 3 years earlier, she would have searched that reflection for reassurance. Tonight, she searched for nothing. The woman looking back at her no longer needed permission to walk into any room. Yet memories had a way of arriving before people did. 11 years earlier, she had first walked beside Graham Halston wearing a simple ivory dress and carrying more hope than jewelry. He had been ambitious, charming, and endlessly convincing whenever he spoke about building a legacy. She believed every word because she saw something inside him worth believing in. During the first years of their marriage, they rented a modest apartment on the north side of Chicago. Graham worked tirelessly chasing investors while Zora spent countless evenings reviewing blueprints, correcting financial projections, and researching historic architecture long after midnight. More than once, she fell asleep at the kitchen table with architectural books spread across the surface and cold coffee sitting beside unfinished sketches. Graham often thanked her privately, promising that one day they would build something together that people would remember for generations. But gratitude slowly became expectation, and expectation quietly became invisibility. As Graham's company grew, Zora noticed a pattern that repeated itself over and over again. During important meetings, she would spend hours refining presentation materials only to hear Graham introduce her as, "My wife helps keep everything organized." Nobody in the room ever learned that many of the restoration concepts being praised had first appeared in Zora's notebooks. When investors applauded innovative ideas, Graham accepted every compliment with practiced confidence, while Zora smiled politely from the back of the room. She convinced herself that marriage meant sharing victories, even when only one name appeared beneath them. Then Blythe arrived. She entered the company as its new communications director, confident, polished, and exceptionally skilled at making every conversation revolve around the future instead of the past. At first, Zora dismissed the subtle changes. Graham worked later. Business dinners became more frequent. Weekend meetings suddenly appeared on the calendar. Whenever she asked if everything was all right, Graham insisted she was imagining problems because she spent too much time worrying. The truth finally arrived not through an argument, but through silence. One evening, Zora walked into Graham's office carrying revised concept drawings for a preservation project. The conference room was empty except for 2 untouched coffee cups and Blythe's silk scarf draped neatly across the back of a chair. Graham looked at Zora without surprise, almost as though he had expected that moment to come eventually. He did not apologize. Instead, he sighed with the exhaustion of someone explaining what he believed was obvious. He told her she was intelligent, but no longer fit the life he was building. He said she lacked presence, that investors responded to confidence, style, and energy, not quiet dedication. Then he spoke the sentence that echoed inside her long after the divorce papers were signed. Some people are meant to stay behind the scenes. Those words followed Zora through every difficult month that came afterward. She left with 2 suitcases, an aging sedan with more than 130,000 miles on the odometer, and a small apartment whose windows overlooked a brick wall instead of the skyline she once admired. Yet among the few boxes she carried was a worn brown leather notebook. Inside were years of handwritten concepts, restoration sketches, and one project Graham had laughed at before tossing it back across the table. Written neatly across the final page were 4 simple words. Astoria Crown Restoration Concept. Zora gently closed the notebook that night and whispered only one promise to herself. One day, the work would finally carry the name of the person who created it. The revolving doors turned with quiet elegance as Zora stepped into the Astoria Crown Hotel, and for one suspended moment, even the musicians seemed to lose the rhythm of the melody they had been playing. The polished marble floor reflected the midnight blue shimmer of her gown, while hundreds of crystal pendants hanging from the towering chandeliers scattered light across the room like tiny stars. Conversations faded one by one until the only sounds remaining were distant violin strings and the soft click of her heels against the stone floor. Every eye turned toward the entrance without anyone asking them to. It was not simply because she looked extraordinary. It was because true confidence carried a presence that could never be purchased. Zora walked neither quickly nor slowly. She walked as though every step already belonged there. She did not search for familiar faces. She did not glance toward Graham. She did not acknowledge Blythe. Instead, her calm eyes moved naturally across the ballroom, appreciating the restored architectural details she had admired years before only through old photographs and forgotten blueprints. For a brief second, Graham forgot to breathe. The woman standing beneath the chandeliers looked nothing like the image he had carefully preserved in his memory. He remembered someone exhausted from working late nights, wearing practical clothes and quietly standing beside him while others congratulated him for ideas that had never truly been his. The woman before him carried herself with effortless elegance, as though every disappointment she had endured had slowly transformed into unshakable grace. Blythe recovered first. Her practiced smile returned, although the confidence behind it had shifted. Almost imperceptibly, she leaned toward one of the guests and whispered something that caused polite laughter to ripple through the nearby group before she gracefully walked toward Zora with her champagne glass still in hand. "Zora," she said warmly, as though greeting an old friend. "I almost did not recognize you." Zora answered with the same calm expression she had worn since entering the room. "Good evening, Blythe." There was no bitterness in her voice, no sarcasm, only courtesy. The simplicity of her reply somehow made Blythe even more uncomfortable. Her eyes drifted slowly over the dazzling gown before she smiled again. "It is absolutely beautiful," she said. "I have to ask, which boutique rented it to you?" A few guests nearby smiled into their drinks, waiting for the awkward explanation they assumed would follow. Zora simply looked at Blythe for a quiet moment before answering. "It was prepared for this evening. Nothing more. No defense. No attempt to impress anyone." The answer created more questions than explanations. Before Blythe could continue, the hotel's general manager hurried across the ballroom with unmistakable purpose. The moment he reached Zora, he stopped respectfully and inclined his head. "Good evening, Ms. Lennox," he said. "The East Salon has been prepared exactly as requested. Please let us know if there is anything else you need before the board arrives." His tone carried the kind of respect usually reserved for distinguished guests whose names appeared on ownership documents rather than invitation lists. Several nearby conversations ended immediately. Blythe blinked, surprised. Graham frowned slightly. Neither of them had arranged anything called the East Salon. Neither understood why the hotel's senior management appeared to know Zora personally. Before either could ask another question, a member of the Astoria Crown Preservation Council crossed the ballroom carrying a sealed leather portfolio. "Ms. Lennox," the woman said politely, offering the portfolio into Zora's hands. "The final review materials are ready whenever you are." Zora accepted it with a simple nod. "Thank you." Graham watched every movement with growing confusion. His eyes lingered on the elegant embossed seal pressed into the leather cover. He had seen that seal before during confidential meetings involving executive approvals. Suddenly, something deep inside him shifted. For the first time since receiving Blythe's idea to invite his former wife, Graham wondered whether they had misunderstood not only who Zora had become, but also the real reason she had walked through those doors that evening. While uncertainty quietly spread through the ballroom, Zora remained composed, her fingers resting lightly on the sealed leather portfolio as though it carried no more weight than an ordinary notebook. The whispers around her faded into the background, replaced by memories of the years nobody in this room had witnessed. 3 years earlier, after the divorce became final, there had been no dramatic rescue waiting for her. No wealthy benefactor. No miraculous opportunity. Only a second-floor studio above an aging furniture restoration workshop in Chicago's historic Bronzeville neighborhood, where the windows rattled every time the elevated train passed a few blocks away. The apartment was barely large enough for a bed, a drafting table, and shelves filled with borrowed books on architectural preservation. During winter, cold air slipped through the old window frames despite every attempt to seal them. Every morning before sunrise, Zora brewed coffee in a chipped ceramic mug she had owned since college, opened her laptop, and studied building codes while the rest of the city still slept. She spent her afternoons restoring carved wood panels, repairing decorative stonework, and documenting forgotten architectural details that most developers considered too expensive to preserve. Her evenings belonged to textbooks, online certification courses, financial planning, and endless revisions of restoration proposals that no one had yet agreed to fund. There were days when the only sound inside her apartment was the scratching of a pencil across tracing paper. There were nights when exhaustion tempted her to stop believing that quiet excellence could ever compete with loud ambition. But every morning she began again. She sold the last expensive piece of jewelry she had kept after the marriage ended, not to replace what she had lost, but to purchase professional design software capable of producing the architectural renderings she envisioned. She learned investment structures, nonprofit financing, preservation tax credits, and public grant systems because she understood that beautiful ideas alone could not save historic buildings. They needed sustainable plans. Slowly, almost invisibly, the projects began arriving. A neighborhood library scheduled for demolition became the first restoration she successfully defended before the city council. A neglected community theater reopened with local ownership preserved because of the financial model she had created. Small victories became larger ones, each adding another quiet layer to a reputation that spread through professional circles rather than newspaper headlines. One rainy afternoon, while presenting a preservation proposal at a public planning hearing, she noticed a man sitting alone in the back row. He wore a simple navy suit, took careful notes, and asked only one question after everyone else had finished discussing profits and construction schedules. He looked at Zora and calmly asked, "When this neighborhood becomes valuable again, who will still be able to afford living here?" The room fell silent because no one else had asked about people. Zora answered without hesitation, explaining a long-term ownership trust that would protect local residents while still allowing responsible investment. The man smiled slightly, thanked her, and quietly introduced himself after the meeting. His name was Everett Vale. He never mentioned that financial magazines regularly listed him among the country's most respected investors. He never offered sympathy for her past. Instead, he asked if he could read the full proposal. Weeks later, they met again, then again, discussing restoration strategies over coffee rather than expensive dinners. Their conversations stretched late into evenings filled with blueprints, community maps, and impossible ideas that slowly became achievable plans. Together they established the Lennox and Vale Heritage Fund, built upon the simple belief that preserving history should also preserve dignity. Everett never tried to rescue Zora because he recognized she had already rescued herself. He simply opened doors that her talent had earned the right to walk through. Standing now beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Astoria crown, surrounded by people who believed they were witnessing the beginning of her embarrassment, Zora quietly remembered every lonely sunrise, every rejected proposal, every hour spent perfecting work no one applauded. None of those moments had been wasted. They had prepared her for the evening when the people who underestimated her would finally be forced to see what patience had built in complete silence. The ballroom gradually found its voice again, but the conversations no longer sounded confident. They had become quieter, slower, interrupted by curious glances that repeatedly drifted toward Zora. People who had never heard her name only minutes earlier suddenly found themselves wondering why senior executives greeted her with such unmistakable respect. Blythe sensed the shift before anyone else admitted it. She smiled through it, but every instinct she possessed told her the evening was no longer unfolding according to the script she had carefully written. Refusing to surrender control, she lifted her champagne glass and walked back toward Zora with graceful determination. "You always did have wonderful taste," Blythe said warmly, allowing her eyes to travel across the remarkable gown. "The craftsmanship is incredible. I imagine something like that must have taken months to rent." A few nearby guests chuckled politely, expecting another uncomfortable moment. Zora looked at Blythe with the same calm expression that had never changed since she entered the room. "It did take months," she answered softly. "Just not for the reason you are thinking." Before Blythe could respond, an elegant woman in her late 60s approached from across the ballroom. Her silver hair was arranged perfectly beneath a small evening fascinator, and several guests immediately stepped aside with obvious respect. She extended her hand toward Zora. "Ms. Lennox," she said with genuine admiration, "I hoped I would have the chance to congratulate you in person." Zora smiled warmly. "It is wonderful to see you again, Eleanor." Eleanor Whitmore, chair of the Bellacourt Heritage Fashion Foundation, turned toward the small gathering surrounding them. "You are all looking at a remarkable piece of American design history," she said. Curious silence spread instantly. "This gown is part of our restoration collection. It carries hand-embroidered patterns inspired by original sketches created decades ago by Ada Mae Lennox, one of the most gifted African-American textile artists of her generation. Her work influenced luxury fashion for years, although very few people ever knew her name." Eleanor gently touched one section of the intricate embroidery without disturbing the fabric. "Zora worked alongside our preservation team for nearly 2 years to restore those forgotten designs with complete historical accuracy. The stones alone required extraordinary security because several are part of a documented museum collection." One guest quietly asked if the valuation being discussed earlier was true. Eleanor smiled. "The current insured value is approximately $1.8 million. An audible breath moved through the surrounding crowd. The laughter disappeared completely. Suddenly the gown no longer looked extravagant. It looked significant. Blythe forced another smile, although the confidence behind it continued fading. Graham stared at Zora without speaking. For years he had convinced himself she lacked the ability to thrive in elite circles. Yet every influential person who approached her seemed to recognize not simply her face, but her work. As Eleanor excused herself, another member of the hotel's preservation committee paused beside Zora. "The ownership review will begin shortly, Ms. Lennox," he said respectfully. "Several board members are already waiting upstairs." Zora thanked him with a simple nod before he quietly walked away. Graham caught only 4 words, but they echoed inside his thoughts. Ownership review. He had attended enough executive negotiations to understand exactly what that phrase usually meant. It was not something discussed with ordinary guests. It belonged to people whose signatures carried authority. Blythe followed Graham's gaze toward the leather portfolio still resting in Zora's hands. "Do you know what is inside that folder?" she whispered. Graham hesitated longer than expected before answering. No, it was the first honest admission he had made all evening. Around them, conversations continued growing quieter as more influential guests found reasons to introduce themselves to Zora. Every greeting added another invisible piece to a puzzle that neither Graham nor Blythe could solve. They had invited her believing she would arrive carrying memories of failure. Instead, she seemed to be carrying something infinitely more valuable. Whatever was inside that portfolio, and whatever business awaited her beyond the doors of the East Salon, Graham could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. For the first time that evening, the certainty he had worn like armor began to crack, replaced by a question he never imagined asking. Had he spent 3 years underestimating the very woman he once believed would never matter without him? The elegant confidence that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier slowly gave way to something far more fragile. It was no longer excitement. It was uncertainty. Guests who had been laughing moments before now found themselves watching Zora instead of the stage where the evening's presentation was supposed to begin. Every new person who approached her seemed to carry the same respectful expression, and every quiet exchange deepened the mystery surrounding her presence. Graham tried convincing himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps she had become a consultant. Perhaps Everett Vale's organization had simply invited her as a preservation specialist. Perhaps the attention surrounding her gown had temporarily exaggerated her importance. He wanted to believe all of those possibilities because each one still allowed him to remain the most influential person in the room. But every passing minute made those explanations harder to accept. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies quietly informed several executives that the formal presentation would begin in 15 minutes. Staff members adjusted lighting near the stage while photographers repositioned themselves for the evening's major announcement. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of escorting Graham toward the reserved seating for development partners, a senior event coordinator politely approached Zora first. "Ms. Lennox," she said with professional courtesy, "the board has asked whether you would prefer to review the updated presentation before everyone is seated." Zora smiled gently. "There is no need. I trust the team." "Very well," the coordinator replied. "We will proceed exactly as approved." Approved. Graham heard the word clearly. He looked toward Blythe, hoping she had not noticed it, but her expression revealed that she had. "Approved by whom?" she whispered under her breath. Before Graham could answer, Another familiar face entered the ballroom through a private corridor rather than the main entrance. Conversations immediately softened as Everett Vale crossed the polished marble floor. Unlike many wealthy executives who attracted attention through dramatic entrances, Everett moved with quiet confidence, greeting hotel employees by name and shaking hands with longtime preservation advocates before acknowledging prominent investors. He was not surrounded by assistants or security. His reputation arrived before he did. Graham recognized him instantly. Everyone in commercial development knew Everett Vale. His investment firm had revitalized historic districts across the country while generating extraordinary long-term returns. Graham had spent years hoping to secure even a single meeting with him, yet every request had been politely declined. Tonight, Everett walked through the ballroom as though he belonged there because, in many ways, he did. Graham instinctively straightened his jacket, preparing to introduce himself if the opportunity appeared. Instead, Everett's attention moved directly past him. He approached Zora with a warm smile that carried genuine familiarity rather than formal politeness. "I hope the rain did not slow you down," he said. "Not at all," Zora answered. "Chicago has taught me to expect weather that changes its mind every hour." Everett laughed softly before noticing the leather portfolio still resting in her hands. "Everything ready?" he asked. "Everything is exactly where it should be," she replied. Their conversation sounded effortless, the kind shared by two people who had solved difficult problems together many times before. Everett never reached for her hand, never attempted to place himself in front of her, and never behaved as though he needed to introduce her to anyone. Instead, he stood beside her as an equal. That small detail caught the attention of more than one guest. Powerful men often commanded attention by becoming the center of every conversation. Everett seemed perfectly comfortable allowing Zora to remain the focus instead. A member of the Astoria Crown Board approached them with a respectful smile. "Mr. Vale, Ms. Lennox, the trustees are assembled whenever you are ready. We will join you shortly," Everett replied before turning back to Zora. "After tonight," he said quietly, "the work finally speaks for itself." Zora nodded with calm certainty. It always did. People are only ready to hear it now. Graham watched the exchange from across the ballroom, feeling something unfamiliar settle into the pit of his stomach. It was not jealousy alone. It was the unsettling realization that whatever relationship existed between Everett Vale and Zora had been built upon mutual respect rather than appearances. And as the ballroom lights subtly dimmed to signal the beginning of the evening's presentation, Graham began to understand that the event he believed would celebrate his future might instead reveal a truth about his past that he had never imagined anyone would uncover. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage, inviting everyone to take their seats for the evening's formal presentation. Crystal glasses settled onto linen-covered tables, conversations softened into whispers, and the orchestra gently lowered its instruments. Graham adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo, believing the moment he had spent years preparing for had finally arrived. Blythe leaned closer with a confident smile that had begun to feel increasingly forced. "Everything is still fine," she whispered. "Whatever role she has here, tonight is still your night." Graham nodded, although the certainty he wanted to project no longer matched the uncertainty growing inside him. As guests settled into their seats, Blythe noticed Zora still standing near the center of the ballroom, speaking quietly with members of the Preservation Council. Determined to reclaim the attention of the room before the presentation began, she made a decision that seemed clever in the moment. She walked toward the stage, accepted a wireless microphone from one of the event coordinators, and laughed lightly, as though she had thought of something spontaneous. "Before we begin," she said with polished charm, "I would love to recognize someone very special. We have an unexpected guest with us tonight." Several heads immediately turned toward Zora. Blythe smiled warmly, the kind of smile that looked gracious until one listened carefully to the words that followed. "Life takes us all on different journeys," she continued. "Some people move forward. Others remind us how far we have come. Graham and I thought it would be meaningful to welcome his former wife this evening and thank her for being part of the chapter that made today possible." A few guests applauded politely, unsure whether they were witnessing a sincere gesture or something else entirely. Graham accepted the microphone after a brief hesitation. He forced an easy smile and looked toward Zora. Zora always had a remarkable imagination, he said. She believed old buildings deserved second chances. I suppose that passion never left her. Light laughter drifted through one corner of the ballroom. Sometimes talent needs direction, Graham continued. Success is not only about having ideas. It is about knowing how to turn them into reality. He paused, glancing briefly at the extraordinary gown she wore. And sometimes appearances can be persuasive. The implications settled quietly over the room. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncomfortable looks. Zora remained exactly where she was, her expression unchanged. She neither smiled nor frowned. She simply waited until the silence naturally returned. Then, carrying the leather portfolio in one hand, she walked toward the stage with measured, graceful steps. No one applauded this time. The room had become too curious for applause. Reaching the podium, she gently placed the sealed portfolio beside the microphone but made no effort to open it. Instead, she looked first at Graham, then at Blythe, before allowing her gaze to sweep across the audience. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm enough that everyone instinctively leaned forward to hear every word. "It is interesting," she said softly, "how often people confuse being unseen with being unimportant." The ballroom became completely silent. "Years ago," she continued, "I learned that recognition does not always arrive at the same time as the work. Sometimes the work waits patiently until the truth is ready." Graham shifted uneasily. Blythe folded her arms, trying to appear unaffected. Zora rested one hand lightly on the unopened portfolio. "Before tonight continues," she said, turning her eyes back toward Graham, "may I ask you one simple question?" Graham forced a smile. "Of course." Zora held his gaze for several long seconds before speaking again. "Did you read the final ownership disclosure before accepting your invitation to present this project tonight?" The question landed with astonishing weight. Graham's smile disappeared almost instantly. His eyes flickered toward the executives seated in the front row, then toward the board members quietly observing from their reserved table. Blythe looked from Graham to Zora in growing confusion. Around the ballroom, whispers began spreading once again, but this time they were filled not with amusement. They were filled with uncertainty. For the first time that evening, the people who had expected Zora to defend herself realized she was not the one standing in the room without answers. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The question hung over the ballroom like a bell that had been struck only once but refused to stop echoing. Graham searched his memory, replaying the stack of legal documents his office had received earlier that week. There had been contracts, financial summaries, architectural revisions, ownership disclosures, and trustee acknowledgments. He remembered skimming most of them before signing the attendance confirmation for the evening's presentation. He had trusted that his legal department would flag anything important. Now, standing beneath the brilliant chandeliers, he realized there was one document he had never opened. Before he could answer, the chairman of the Astoria Crown Preservation Trust rose from the front table and calmly approached the stage. The room immediately stood in respectful silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before the scheduled presentation continues, the board has one important announcement regarding the future stewardship of the Astoria Crown Restoration Project." Graham instinctively stepped forward, believing this was the introduction he had expected all evening. Instead, the chairman turned toward Everett Vale. "Mr. Vale, thank you for your vision and leadership." Everett nodded politely, but remained where he was. "The true recognition belongs elsewhere," he replied. Then, without hesitation, he looked toward Zora. The chairman smiled warmly. "Several months ago, the Lennox and Vale Heritage Fund completed the acquisition of the controlling ownership interest in the Astoria Crown Restoration Trust. Tonight we are honored to formally introduce the project's co-chair and chief restoration architect, Ms. Zora Lennox." The ballroom fell completely silent. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a moment, as though they needed to process what they had just heard. Graham stared at Zora in disbelief. Blythe slowly turned toward him, searching his face for an explanation that never came. The chairman continued, "Many of the preservation concepts guiding this restoration originated more than a decade ago. During our archival review, we confirmed that the earliest comprehensive design proposal submitted for this property carried one signature." He nodded gently toward the large screen behind the stage. The ballroom lights dimmed as the presentation changed. An architectural rendering of the Astoria crown appeared, dated 12 years earlier. In the lower right corner, beneath careful handwritten drafting notes, one elegant signature stood alone. Zora Lennox. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Graham recognized the drawing immediately. He remembered dismissing those ideas years ago as unrealistic. He remembered telling Zora that no serious investor would ever finance such an ambitious preservation plan. Yet now that same concept filled the enormous screen behind him as the official foundation of the project's future. The chairman spoke again. Ms. Lennox's vision inspired the restoration strategy ultimately adopted by this trust. Her work, together with the Lennox and Vale Heritage Fund, will guide every major design decision moving forward. Everett finally stepped beside Zora, not in front of her. No one gave Zora this position, he said calmly. She earned it long before most of us realized it. Another board member approached carrying a second folder. There is one additional matter, she announced. During our routine compliance review, portions of an architectural proposal submitted by Halston Urban Properties were found to substantially resemble previously documented concepts contained within Ms. Lennox's archived restoration materials. In keeping with our governance policies, the matter has been referred to an independent professional review. No conclusions have been reached, and the evaluation will proceed fairly and transparently. There were no accusations, no dramatic confrontation, only a calm statement of process. Yet its impact was unmistakable. Graham lowered his eyes toward the floor. For the first time that evening, he understood that the greatest loss before him was not a contract. It was the realization that he had once stood beside the brilliant mind now being honored by the entire room and had failed to recognize her value when it mattered most. Zora remained composed throughout the announcement. She did not celebrate. She did not look toward Blythe. She did not seek satisfaction in Graham's silence. She simply accepted the recognition with quiet gratitude, because the moment was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about finally allowing the truth to stand where it had always belonged. The applause that followed was warm, respectful, and lasting, but when it finally faded, Zora did not remain on the stage to enjoy the attention. She thanked the chairman with a quiet smile, exchanged a few words with members of the preservation board, and stepped down as gracefully as she had walked in. The cameras continued flashing, yet she never paused to pose. Recognition had finally arrived, but she treated it as a responsibility rather than a victory lap. Around the ballroom, conversations resumed with an entirely different tone. Guests who had politely ignored her earlier now introduced themselves with genuine admiration. Architects congratulated her on preserving the original vision of the Astoria crown. Community leaders thanked her for protecting the city's history. Young designers quietly watched from across the room, seeing in her something they rarely witnessed at events like this. Someone whose authority came from years of invisible work instead of loud self-promotion. Graham remained standing near the stage long after everyone else had begun moving again. His champagne glass sat untouched on a nearby table. The confidence he had worn throughout the evening had disappeared, replaced by the uncomfortable clarity that sometimes arrives too late. Eventually, he gathered enough courage to walk toward Zora, finding her alone for a brief moment near the grand windows overlooking the rain-soaked streets of downtown Chicago. City lights shimmered across the wet pavement below, reflecting softly through the glass. "Zora," he said quietly. She turned with the same calm expression she had carried all evening. "Congratulations," he continued. "I should have said that years ago." She nodded politely. "Thank you." Silence settled between them for several seconds. Graham looked down before speaking again. "I was wrong about you." Zora did not interrupt. "No," she answered gently. "You were wrong about what you chose to see." He closed his eyes briefly, accepting the truth of those words. "I spent years believing I was the one building everything," he admitted. "Tonight, I realized how much of it began with you." There was no anger in her face, no satisfaction, only peace. Graham hesitated before asking the question that mattered most to him. "Is there anything I can do to make things right?" Zora looked through the rain-covered windows before answering. "The board will review every proposal fairly. Your company will receive the same process as everyone else. Nothing more, nothing less." It was the kind of fairness he had rarely offered her. He nodded slowly, understanding that she was not punishing him. She was simply refusing to abandon the principles that had brought her this far. Graham managed a faint smile filled with regret. I suppose that is exactly what you always deserved. Before he could say anything else, Everett approached quietly, carrying Zora's black cashmere cloak over one arm. He did not interrupt their conversation. He simply waited until Graham stepped back. Then he offered the coat without placing it around her shoulders. Zora accepted it herself, slipping into it with the same independence that had defined every choice she made since rebuilding her life. Everett smiled. Ready? She looked once across the ballroom. Near the service entrance, the small table where Blythe had arranged the Lonely Place cards still stood untouched. The chair reserved for the forgotten guest had remained empty all night. Zora allowed herself one final glance before turning away. She did not need to sit in the place someone else had chosen for her, because she had spent the last 3 years building a place of her own. Side by side, she and Everett walked toward the hotel's grand entrance, neither leading nor following the other. As the revolving doors opened, cool evening air drifted inside, carrying the scent of fresh rain. Behind them, the enormous presentation screen still displayed the original architectural drawings signed with her name, illuminated beneath the crystal chandeliers for everyone to see. Zora stepped into the Chicago night without looking back, because the greatest triumph of her life was never making the people who underestimated her feel small. It was finally seeing herself exactly as she had always deserved to be seen. She had not returned to reclaim a marriage, win an argument, or seek revenge. She had returned as the author of her own story, and for the first time, the entire world was reading her name on the first page.